All right, so let's talk about compression at this point. So we're going to be gaining some more loudness kind of in stages like we've talked about, right? We've gotten some loudness from the inflator. We've gotten some loudness from our limiter at the end of the chain, but we'll also be getting a little bit from our compressors, but that's by far and away like not the point of compression. The entire point of compression is actually to basically reduce the transient information or some of the dynamics in your overall mix. We're trying to create a glue across the entire track now so that the whole song kind of just, again, belongs together a bit more, pumps together a bit more. And this, again, like most things in mastering, is going to be a fairly subtle technique. Now, the SSL compressor is a very, very popular compressor. I mean, if you were to have the analog version of this, it's a $30,000 compressor or something crazy like that. But what we're going to be using is the Waves emulation of that. And pretty much most companies, I feel like, have some version of an SSL compressor. Again, it's one of the most, if not the most popular, like bus compressor out there. So you can find so many variations of this. If you have Logic, you've got a version of an SSL inside of your compressor modes and whatnot. If you are in Ableton, there's a bus compressor that's very similar. I wouldn't worry about having this exact plugin, but this is a great starting point. So what I'm going to do is actually set this compressor to its least sensitive settings, meaning it's going to be basically off and doing nothing. And to do that, the attack would be at its slowest, right? Its release would be at its fastest, right? That just means that the attack is taking the longest for it to activate. So it's, again, least sensitive. The release is also being activated or coming back into the mix faster, which means that the compressor isn't holding on to the information for as long. We've got makeup gain at +3, which we're going to turn off. We're going to set our threshold at +15, which means it's doing pretty much nothing. And our attack is set to a 2-to-1 ratio. We can leave the analog button on here. That's basically the analog hum, so we'll just leave that going. And what we're going to do is basically play, one of these loud portions of the track, which is usually the drop. And we are going to pull down on this threshold now until we start to see about 2 to maybe 3 at the most dBs of gain reduction. So I'm going to play this, and that's what's going to happen. And just watch this arrow. That'll give you the amount of gain reduction that's happening. So we've actually taken away a little bit of loudness here we're losing, 2 dBs of gain reduction overall. So let's make that back up. And we can even maybe we're pretty loud. So I'm actually going to lower this by a half a dB and gain back half that dB here. Yeah, and this compressor is doing a really good job acting as a glue. And now I would also reach for, a second favorite compressor of yours that you may have handy. I personally used to use the Waves Puke Child all the time. I thought that was a great compressor for this, but since I have UAD stuff, I might as well use it, right? This is a beautiful mastering compressor. Basically, as a starting point, I just like to throw on this mastering medium as a starting point. I flick this into stereo mode so it affects both the left and right side, and we don't have to worry about doing things on each side of this compressor. And then we're going to have our, basically we're just going to kind of the same thing that we were just doing with the Waves SSL. We're just going to pull down on this threshold until we get about a dB or so of gain reduction. And again, we're getting really loud, so I'm just going to lower this a good amount. And what we're going to do now with our compressors set, I'm going to go actually into the low end of this track and try to just bring out a bit of the weight in this song. So again, we're working in a master right now, a stereo master. We don't have access to the stems for this track. So if I did have access to the stems, I could probably just go in and compress just the kick and bass relationship together and maybe bring that up in volume without having to do this kind of on the master. But this is a great technique and something that you should totally have in your arsenal, especially if you're mastering other people's music. So what we're going to do is start by just taking the lowest band and moving this around until all that we hear is the kick and the bass. If we hear any chords or bleeding of, reverbs and synths and stuff like that, then we're too high up. That sounds about right. I feel like we've locked in on the right range. What we're going to do is kind of set a medium release and attack. Basically just not looking for anything super fast or super slow, just right in the middle. The ratio is going to be 2-to-1, and we're just going to pull down on this compressor gain reduction knob here and try to get about a dB or 2 of gain reduction in this low end. So what we're doing is compressing everything below 170. And now that we've compressed it and basically lost about a dB and a half or up to 2 dBs, I'm going to bring this back up by 3 dBs to give us a nice healthy boost of everything below 170. Now, to be entirely honest, I think this trick is incredible. Like, we just gained several dBs of weight and low end in our entire track by just compressing it slightly and then bringing it back up. And there's no clipping, there's nothing kind of, ugly happening here as a result. So whether or not this track actually needs it, I would probably listen to a few reference tracks to kind of help determine that. But I think for the purposes of learning this technique, this is just a great example of how much more weight and power you can really get from something like this. So just one last time, I'm just going to play it and bypass it and mute it a few times so you can hear its effect. And I think I'm going to settle more on like 3.5. Yeah, and that's sounding really good.